We choose to go to the moon. Mr. Toastmaster, fellow Toastmasters, ladies and gentlemen, with those words in the speech in 1961, President John Kennedy committed the United States to landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to Earth. Now, at the time, the Americans had just, as we'll see in our next slide, managed, eventually, after many failures, to put a man into orbit, and which was just a short launch up into the sky and back down again. Little more than a cannon shot and a descent by parachute back down to the ocean. This was an extraordinary thing for the people working in the aerospace industry to hear, because the Americans had been failing, had been beaten by the Russians at every turn. They had been behind the Russians in putting a man into space, and they were about to be left behind in putting in the first man into orbit. So for the people working in the aerospace industry to hear that suddenly they were going to fly into Earth orbit, then to the moon, land on the moon, and then come safely back, this was an extraordinary challenge. Most of the engineers at the time were quite young, and many of them just thought, that's okay, we can do that. But it was an extraordinary challenge because they had no rockets, they had no rocket motors, they had no guidance systems, they had no computers. And when they get the computers, they had no software. Nobody really heard about software. In fact, one of the computer technicians working on the project was on his way to dinner one night, and his wife said, now dear, don't tell people you're working in software. But they were going to have to invent all these things. And if you go to the next slide, you'll see that the size of the capsule there for the first manned mission into space, which was a very short mission, only lasting minutes, is just a tiny little, it looks like a recycled dustbin. So how are they going to get from that to the moon and back? And first of all, how are they going to develop this rocket system and this spaceship? Bill's going to tell us a little bit about that.
Thank you, Kieran. First of all, to get the picture, we'll go back a little bit in time. When World War II came to an end in 1945, there was a surge of interest in science fiction. This was due in part to the atomic bomb, and also due to the German V-2 rocket. So it's not surprising that in 1950, the big, spectacular Hollywood film of the year was Destination Moon. In the film, a group of people built a gigantic single-stage rocket. Now, the single stage simply means a standalone, self-complete unit, like a car or a ship. This rocket is powered by a nuclear-fueled rocket motor, something that NASA still hasn't managed to produce. And in it, the crew make a spectacular special effects journey to the surface of the moon, and there, after some dodgy adventures, they eventually make it safely back to Earth again. But the real rocket engineers knew perfectly well that you couldn't do a thing like that with the single-stage rocket, for the simple reason that you just couldn't get enough fuel into one for it to be able to travel any worthwhile distance. The solution, which both the Russians and the Americans came up with, was the multi-stage rocket. And this is simply one that's built as a separate series of units and stages, which are then bolted together to make the final product. And the advantage this has is that as each component is finished and done with, it can be jettisoned. And the rocket doesn't have to ferry around any more weight than it needs to do at any given time. Now, the Russians are ahead of the game. And in September 1957, they astonished the world by putting the first man-made satellite, Sputnik, into Earth orbit. They followed this with a series of successes. They first sent animals up to the edge of space, brought them safely back, sent humans into Earth orbit, brought them safely back. And while all this was happening, the Americans were having a series of disasters, as one rocket after another exploded on the launch pad, exploded just after getting off the launch pad, or if it did manage to go some distance along its path, something went wrong with the guidance systems, and control was reaching for the self-destruct button. All of which left President Kennedy a very worried man. And Kieran, why was he so worried?
Well, Bill, it wasn't so much about space travel, and that sounds very adventurous and it sounds like a great adventure. But what was happening was the Russians weren't just building rockets, and very successful rockets. And it seemed that the German scientists that were captured and engineers that were captured after the war, the ones that the Russians got seemed to be doing better than the ones, the German scientists and engineers that the Americans got, because they were beating them all the time. But the real worry was they would develop nuclear weapons. And now they had a delivery system, a rocket, to which they could attach this nuclear weapon. But it was worse. They had launched Sputnik, this satellite, into space. And what the Americans were really afraid of was that the Russians, who seemed to be winning this race, would have a platform in space over America, loaded with nuclear weapons, ready to land on the States, and the Americans would have no defense for it. So Kennedy decided this was not going to happen, and he spoke repeatedly about creating American preeminence in space. He wanted to leapfrog the Russians and produce a better system, better technology, and beat the Russians at their own game. Bill.
The end result of all this American drive and effort, and the key to the success of the Apollo program, was the Saturn V rocket. And what a machine! On the launch pad, as you see in the model, it stood nearly twice the height of Liberty Hall here in Dublin, and it weighed over 2,700 tons. On the screen, you can see on our next slide a cutaway, and that shows the different stages of this rocket. So starting at the bottom of the rocket, on the extreme left of the screen, is stage 1. This is essentially a glorified fuel tank with rocket motors attached. Next, moving to the right on the screen, stage 2, also basically a flying fuel tank. Next one up, we have stage 3. Now that's a bit more complicated. It has its own rocket motor, certainly, it has its own fuel supply, but at the top, it also has a cargo bay. And on the screen, that's shown with the doors open. And just in front of it is the cargo which it will be carrying, the lunar landing craft. Now on the launch pad, as you see there, those doors are closed. And sitting on top of that section, we have the next two parts up, which are the command module and the service module. Now the command module is the small, conical, insignificant looking bit, but it actually is the spacecraft in which 3 astronauts will live and work for the duration of a trip to the moon and back again. And that part of the rocket is the only part of that entire structure which will make the complete round journey from the surface of the Earth into space and back to Earth again. And finally, sitting on top is the escape tower. That is the astronaut's equivalent of the fighter pilot's ejector seat. And its job is, if something should go wrong in the early stages of the launch, it will fire up its own motor and pull the command module safely away from danger. Now back to stage 1 again. It's by far the biggest part of the entire rocket, and it weighs over 2,000 tons. On our next slide, you can see an idea of just how big it was. Look, even though it's lying on its side, being taken to the launch pad for assembly, look at the people beside it and look at how it completely dwarfs them. And notice too those 5 black discs. Those are the covers over its 5 huge rocket motors. And it needs every one of them, because their job is to lift this entire structure, all 2,759 tons of it, off the ground and start it moving on the path up towards Earth orbit. And it's here, right at the very start, that things could start to go seriously wrong.
Yes, Bill, because the thing about a rocket is, it is actually a machine, like an aeroplane in a sense, or any other machine. It has engines at the base, but it has no steering, it has no wings. So the only way it can stay upright once it's released is literally, what Aoife is doing, moving the base of the rocket to remain underneath the top of the rocket. And if she can't do that, this will fall over. But the problem is, there's a tower standing right beside it. And the guys up on the top, they didn't expect this much movement. And they are really scared. They think this is going to hit the tower. And if it hits the tower, 95% of this is fuel. This is a bomb. But luckily, after a few seconds, they hear the ground say, Apollo 11, you have cleared the tower. And they breathe a sigh of relief. Bill.
When safely clear of the tower, stage 1 continues to push onwards and upwards. It will reach a height of 38 miles and a speed of over 5,000 miles an hour, but those 5 huge engines are gulping fuel at a rate of 16 tonnes a second. And just 2.5 minutes after launch, the tank runs dry. Stage 1 is immediately discarded and let fall back to Earth, and stage 2 motor fires. Now it will continue to push for the next 6 minutes, and during that time, it will also discard that escape tower, which is no longer needed. But eventually, stage 2 reaches its agreed height, 109 miles up, speed of 15,300 miles an hour. And it too shuts down. Now it separates from stage 3. And we have a little clip which shows what happens as stage 3 fires its engine and it begins to move away. Stage 2 is simply discarded. Now stage 3, for the next 7 minutes, will very carefully nudge itself a further 10 miles higher into Earth orbit and a final speed of 25,000 miles an hour. That is Dublin to New York in just 7.5 minutes. And now that they're safely in orbit and over the first real stage of the whole program, the astronauts are going to start getting very busy in the very near future. Kieran.
Thanks, Bill. Well, the stage 3 rocket is still intact with the lunar module in its hangar, the command and service module on top, and the tower is gone. And they do a few orbits, about 4 orbits of the Earth, checking out systems, and then they fire the stage 3 rocket one more time. And this sets it on its way to the moon. But all isn't over yet, because what they must do now is, they must now discard stage 3. At every opportunity, they leave the machinery behind that they no longer need, and reduce the total weight of the system. So they're now travelling towards the moon, and the next slide will show you I hope the next slide will show you the trajectory. No, it's not. Sorry, we'll wait for this one. What it must do now is it's on its way to the moon, and what happens now is the command and service module separates from stage 3. It turns 180 degrees and then docks with the lunar module. Now you can see above and below, you'll see the doors of the hangar have flown off to expose the lunar module, this very spidery, delicate craft which will land on the moon. The docking maneuver, fortunately, is successful, and the command module is able to instruct the stage 3 to release the lunar module, and it pulls the lunar module away. At this stage, the lunar module, with the command module and the service module, rotate 180 degrees again to point back towards the moon, and the stage 3, the remaining stage 3, is nudged out of the way so it doesn't have any danger of clashing later on with the Apollo 11 system. So on the way to the moon, we have the graphic there showing the route, and this is what they do. It's a figure of 8. You can see on the left they've launched, they've gone into orbit, and then they do another burn, and that sends them on the way to the moon. And that graphic just to the right of the Earth and below the Earth, that is the extraction phase where they remove the LEM from the stage 3. A little bit further along, having taken lots of measurements, they do a burn to correct their track, their trajectory. That's a midpoint correction, or a midpoint correction, so that they get their alignment correct with the moon. And if you think that they're approaching to a spot where the moon is not actually at yet, the moon hasn't arrived, so they're trying to arrive at the same point on their orbit at the same time. If they miss that, then they don't have enough fuel to return to Earth. So it's very important that the orbit is captured. And this burn